I saw a film the other day. It's called The Reason I Jump, and it's based on a book written by Naoki Higashida, a 13-year-old autistic child. The film was moving at so many levels and taught me a lot about autism. But speaking to Matt Davis, father of a 13-year-old autistic child, has been even more enriching. Hearing Matt's honest appraisal of his own unconscious biases can teach us all how to be more compassionate and appreciate, as Matt says, that the world is an unlevel playing field. This is Between Us, Stories of Unconscious Bias. I am Smita Tharoor. I'd like to introduce Matt Davis. Matt lives in London with his wife Eliza and two children, Isaac and Tabitha. 13-year-old Isaac is autistic, and Matt writes a blog about his experiences. If you would like to know more about his journey and his experiences of bringing up a 13-year-old son who is autistic, I would urge you to read it. The blog page is mysonisac.net. In addition to that, he is also a trustee of Autistica and parent patron and business ambassador for Ambitious About Autism. And if that's not enough, Matt is also a partner at the Red Brick Road, an advertising agency in London. I'm really pleased that Matt has made some time to speak with me today and to share his stories of unconscious bias. Thank you so much, Matt.
Hi, nice to speak to you.
So, Matt, first off, we're talking unconscious bias. What do you understand by that?
Well, it's such a big phrase, really. When I first think of it, I go back in time to my student days because I studied psychology quite a long time ago. I won't say when. And unconscious bias then meant kind of Jungian and Freudian. He wasn't particularly on trend at the time, but I kind of think of that. And so it unleashes quite a lot of thought in me. But it also, I guess now, with Isaac and autism being a major part of my universe, if you like, I think it really tells me about people and the non-autistic world and how difficult it is for autistic people. It's improved a lot, and I think that's all within an unconscious bias. I think certainly looking at myself, and I'm looking at everything from educationalists, general people in the streets, fellow parents over the last kind of 13 years. The difficulties Isaac has had are so often down to just a lack of awareness and a lack of knowledge. And I think that feeds directly into an unconscious bias. I think we are programmed at some stage into how parenting should be and how childhood should be. And it's quite different to how the experience of autism. And when I say that, I'm a parent. I'm not autistic myself, so my son has got the lived-in experience. But I just believe it's become quite a useful term when I just think of the neurotypical, which neurotypical basically means non-autistic, how the non-autistic world may see the autistic world. There's a kind of just a general default in the way we, because I can include myself in that, behave, because the world's set up for neurotypical over autistic people.
No, that makes absolute sense. And I do wonder, with the benefit of hindsight, how different is your understanding of, specifically because you have an autistic child who's now 13, but how different is your understanding to when you were sitting in college studying psychology and, learning about Freud? I mean, I suspect you can see the similarities, can you not?
Oh God, yeah. I mean, that back then when I was a carefree student, it was all so theoretical. None of it really had any sort of reality at that age as well. It's funny how the name, things. Funny, I often think of. I didn't pursue. I graduated in psychology. I had about a kind of few months into looking at postgraduate studies, and then very rapidly realised it wasn't for me. I didn't have the relevant skill set and concentration and knowledge to do that. But quite often I see my degrees, specifically since I've become a father and father to Isaac, has quite often come back as a sort of unwelcome guest, because a lot of what I learned was about childhood and development and neuroscience to a degree. It was very much in its infancy back then. But there are lots of things that just I learned and have become relevant. So, as I say, this has got an unwelcome guest. Things like stages of development, language acquisition device, and actually disability and stigma and labeling, and it unleashes all this kind of stuff that probably was quite useful unexpectedly because of how the brain works and our theories and how difference is applied. So yeah, comparing me now with me then, somehow I armed myself with some knowledge, and then maybe I've unconsciously used it.
And I think
I hadn't thought it that way.
No, but I think also what you just said earlier is very, very valuable to all of us listeners, including me. And the fact that we only become aware of these things when it becomes a lived in experience, whatever that might be. You have a lived in experience of living with and having a son who is autistic. So you have 13 years of that lived in experience. Many of us don't. And therefore, our connection and our understanding of that is not as motivated as it is for you, because this is your life. And I think with all of us, whatever our unconscious biases might be, they come because of whatever our lived in experience might be, what kind of things teach us something about ourselves, whatever that looks like. It could be an illness, it could be a job, it could be travel. Doesn't have to be negative, it doesn't have to be positive. It could be just life experiences that impact on us, and therefore attempts to make us think about what does unconscious bias look like. I don't know if I'm making sense, but what I'd like from you, Matt, though, is perhaps if you could just expand on this idea of understanding autism and with your son under the context of unconscious bias. I wonder if you could share a story.
Yeah, I think I could probably share quite a few stories. So, going back to that earlier point, it absolutely has informed kind of everything, really. I think since he was born, and for the last 13 years, I've learnt so much and adapted, and now I've just got this phenomenal young teenager who is so different but so talented and charming and brings light to us every day, and his neurodiversity is phenomenal. So that was something completely unexpected, and I guess the unconscious bias happened. I'd say the main story happened with his education. Is where I think I experienced it the most, from his early days, when there was a bit of a perfect storm of, he was at nursery. He got diagnosed, I should say, when he was 3, with autism. And autism it's a very broad spectrum. That's the other thing I do always emphasize. And there's a famous quote that I think Stephen Shaw said: when you met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism.
Right.
And it's really, really true. However, that quote it's brilliant in showing how broad and flexible the spectrum is, and how you have people of all ethnicities and gender and all abilities on a spectrum. However, you do need some coordinates, I think, to give you an idea of what's the constant. Is there a constant amongst autistic people? Isaac's very able. He's at a specific autistic school, but they access the curriculum. There's no reason why he won't do his exams, potentially go to college. Who knows? He's got, his potential is huge. Other people who are autistic have more challenges. Some have less challenges. It's really, really broad. I think the one constant, which again autistic adults concur, which I think is really important, because it's as I say, I'm talking through the eyes of my son, if you like. But that's where, and someone has said, there's a difference with the social instinct, and that's the unconscious bias I experienced from a really, really early age with him, where everyone you interact with, from kind of close family to other children to other parents, expect a normal way of being for a child. And that's right from kind of age 0, from sleep training, crying, feeding, crawling, milestones, tantrums, starting to speak. There are these set milestones that we have. And what happened with Isaac was he was late with all these milestones. And every lateness, I felt I was doing something wrong, because everybody else was, oh, that child is crawling, or that child's now babbling, or that child is showing social impulse. And at every moment, Isaac wasn't doing it. And with every milestone missed, he was more and more tormented and tortured and upset. And we just had, from kind of 0 till, and he knows this, we've had these conversations with him, from kind of 0 to when he was diagnosed, a really upset little boy. And it's nothing more heartbreaking than having a child who is loved and healthy, physically healthy and in a comfortable environment. Something's wrong if he's not happy. For quite a lot of the time.
But sorry, I'm just trying to understand this. Firstly, I think we need to understand this is your firstborn child.
Yes.
And
sorry,
therefore you
yes,
have no clue
absolutely.
how
No
to bring
clue
up
whatsoever.
children or milestones or any of the things that we talk about if you've had more than one, because then you kind of know these things work. So it's your firstborn. And then secondly, what you're saying to me, which I find very moving, and I just want us to capture that before we continue. You're saying to me that you as a parent, because you were looking around at other parents with similar age children, or you knew other parents and other babies and so on in other homes, and you were unconsciously expecting the same from your child.
Absolutely.
And therefore your unconscious bias was impacting on the little child, who was deeply unhappy because he knew instinctively, even if he is now called autistic, he knew that something is not right because he could see your unhappiness. Is that what you're saying?
Well, do you know what? That's a really interesting interpretation, because it's partially what I'm saying. I'm certainly saying that so yes, he's my oldest child, I should have said. I've got other nieces and nephews, and so I saw other children. I knew it would be tough. I knew having a baby is tough, and I knew it would be life-changing, and I knew there'd be the sleepless nights and everything. But I figured there's this sort of survival mechanism that triggers, and whilst it's very tough, you have all these moments that are amazing, and you work your way through, unless you have other huge hurdles that are unpredictable. So I think that was my unconscious bias. Whether he saw me upset, it's likely, because I really was upset. There were times when I just found it so difficult, because he was so upset, because in hindsight now, we were doing things like breaking a routine. So when he was 2, he was at a nursery that had no comprehension of autism at all. He got diagnosed just after 3, and in the year up to it, we were seeing speech therapists and doctors, but the diagnosis process took a year. So even at that stage, I had no idea of autism. So I might go to the nursery, something as simple as driving a different route, and he would scream and be so distressed, and I'd have to drag him out of the car and take him into the nursery, and they wouldn't understand why he was so upset. And everyone else would just go, oh, he's 2, he's having a tantrum. And those comments used to grate and eat me up inside, because I just need something. I think weirdly, this is where unconscious bias has this split sort of two-way. It's a double-edged sword, because part of my unconscious bias was going, you're doing something wrong. And that's, to go back to your point, maybe he was misreading me being upset. But the other side was, I knew something wasn't right as well. I just didn't know what it was. I didn't have the language or the knowledge to translate all these points he was struggling with, if that makes sense.
Completely. And I don't know Isaac, but I feel like going and giving him a hug at age 2, having what you and I call a tantrum, because that's what children do. And many of us, including me and many of our listeners, will visualize a little child lying in a supermarket and kicking up his legs or her legs. And, yes, children do that all the time. So why should this be any different? But it was, and it is. And it was because of the fact that there were other things going on that you were unaware of. So thank you for sharing that, Matt. I really appreciate it. But yeah, do go on. I mean, we would love to hear some more stories around this for our own understanding.
Yeah, sure. So So yeah, so once he got yeah, the bias is kind of they kind of accelerated really. Once he got diagnosed. So he got diagnosed. It's 10 years ago, pretty much, just over 10 years ago. So it was beginning of 2011 when he was 3 and 4 months, and then we had quite a strange process in that I felt I was experiencing. I saw it as really empowering, and then again, this goes back to my degree. I studied labeling a lot and stigma. When we got the label of autism, it felt, there's an explanation. There was something to learn, and it was empowering, and it described why Isaac was like he was. Where it became tricky was telling people about it, because no one seemed to really want to hear it. People were, and this is outside of the autistic world, it was also 10 years ago. I think there's a lot more autism acceptance and awareness now. Still a long way to go, but there feels like there's been development in the last 10 years. But we'd tell the school or the nursery we were at, and it was always met with a sort of bit of an indifference, as in, do you want to give your child that label? Don't all children have tantrums? A lot of children are late to speak. You were a late talker. There was felt like a need for other people to normalize and not lean in and embrace that label. And me and my wife, who have always been on exactly the same page, which is incredibly valuable. I think if parents are not on the same page in something like this, then you're in trouble. And there's no reason why you would be on the same page. I just think our values met and how we wanted to care for our son sort of echoed each other. But that was certainly for the first year or so, just a need to kind of normalize and go, and people would sort of say, oh yeah, aren't we all like that? Aren't we a little bit? Or, some of us, yeah, we walk later, we talk later. There was a real fear that either we were embracing the label too much, or people didn't really want to be part of it. And that I found really difficult.
I'm sure, because I'm just trying to understand this. So essentially what you're saying, if I, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there was, of course, a huge sense of relief, especially from the age of 2 to 3. There was unhappiness, there was tantrums, there was frustration on both the parents and the child. And then there was finally, hooray, we know there is some issue, we can deal with it. So I imagine that both you and Eliza were extremely relieved that he now was given, for want of a better word, a label. Yes, Isaac has autism.
Yeah.
And so the second bit is what I'm trying to understand a little bit about. So were you wanting now to shout it from the rooftops? But the people that you're connected with are all slightly embarrassed about it. And they're saying, no. You know what? Let's just normalize this. That's what you're saying, right?
That's what I'm saying. And fast. And again, this is unconscious. This is my perception. There was certainly a hesitancy amongst pretty much most people, in my opinion, around it, because actually no one really knew about autism anyway. That was in my world, for whatever. I didn't know anything about it. However, fast forward now, and I did want to shout it from the rooftops pretty quickly. We got involved with certain charities like Ambitious About Autism fairly quickly, and fast forward a few years, and then now, and everyone close to me is an enormous champion of autism, want to understand it more, see Isaac for his brilliance, see neurodiversity for the sort of critical nature it is within the human condition. So I'm kind of journeying back to a time when for some reason there's a want to normalize, as you say. That was exactly what happened. But this story's turned very positive very quickly, partly because I think we shouted it from the rooftops, partly because Isaac started getting intervention from experts who understood him and enabled him to shine and thrive in the way he can. And now, as I say, at 13, we've got this extraordinary young man who is so special. And autism is a part of him. A lot of things are a part of him. The label is absolutely critical and empowering, and something that he uses himself a lot. But equally, he is British and he's Jewish and he's into trains and he's a brother and a son and a nephew. It's just part of his tapestry.
I think that's just wonderful. And the fact that the fact that you and your family and your son do not see the word autism in a negative way. And that is what the listeners need to hear. Certainly, I think there are some, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the fact that he was born when he was, rather than say 30 years ago. I mean, of course, you wouldn't have had a child 30 years ago, but do you see what I'm saying?
No, 100%. I see us as I see us quite fortunate for a number of reasons at that. I feel if Isaac was now 2 or 3, having had just been in the global pandemic, that really scares me, because the intervention he had, face to face, was critical, and knowing that would have dried up for sort of 6 months at that age where it's so critical to get intervention. That scares me. That's something that unpredictable that happened. But you're completely right. 30 years ago, awareness 0. And it's funny, Isaac said to me recently, I mentioned my recent blog, he said to me, Dad, who were your autistic friends when you were young? And it really stumped me. I was really kind of, God, I didn't have any. I probably did.
Maybe you did. I was about to say.
I'm sure I did. But do you know what? In that era,
nobody would say that. Yeah.
No one would say, and they would either learn to really adapt and have quite painful, if they were able to, or they would be sort of marginalised. And I look back and I remember children who were marginalised, both educationally and physically, and clearly they were on the spectrum, and maybe had other conditions as well. But that just, I feel fortunate for exactly the time he was born, because the historically, and this is well documented, the way autistic people have been treated over here. It's still a human rights issue, I should say, by the way. When you look at things like employment and other angles, the autistic community are hugely discriminated against. But it improves. It's improving. There's a hell of a long way to go. But yeah, I look back, and when Isaac said that to me, that really threw me. It also, quite interesting, I think I wrote that in one of my blog posts, and a friend of ours who's a psychotherapist interpreted it in a way. She said, "Oh, I wonder if he was just sort of saying, would you be my friend if you were young, Dad?" And I thought, God, that's really interesting as well. So he's really, there's, without a doubt, he has taught me so much. I was very, before not only is it's not just because I didn't know anything about autism and I wasn't a father. So obviously that's
big in itself.
A lot of fathers say, but just the way I see people. And the one word I use a lot is compassion. I wasn't a nasty person, and I had did have a moral compass. But the idea of compassion and seeing people for who they are, embracing difference, I didn't know so much about it, and now I see compassion as just this amazing trait, and he has completely unearthed that in myself, without a shadow of a doubt. And it's the way I look at people from all ages and all, just throughout the whole humanity. I'd say my experience with Isaac has absolutely made that flourish within me. I'm not saying, hey, I'm a compassionate person. Don't really like that. I just see the value of compassion is extraordinary. And Isaac's got an amazing radar for it. So I think when he meets people, autistic or not non-autistic either, who kind of he engages with, he gives so much back, and he has this kind of intoxicating charm, because I think they're showing him love and interest and adapting to his way, and he does it back, and he's so polite and interesting and sort of stimulating a young man.
I'm just smiling and nodding, hearing you. I'm trying to visualize Isaac. Of course, I haven't had the pleasure of meeting him, but this, what you're talking about to me is is just essentially understanding our own unconscious bias, isn't it? You were lucky enough that you have a child who is autistic, who is, and because of living with him, you have honed your understanding and your skills. And you use the word compassion, but it is understanding your own unconscious bias, and therefore not making assumptions about the world, seeing each of them,
Yeah.
whatever the situation, for its own merit, rather than jumping to conclusions.
Yes.
And that's what compassion is about, isn't it? Don't you
Yes.
think?
Yes, I absolutely think it is, and I think compassion has it has so many facets. It's just such an amazingly positive energy about it, and it has to that. I haven't. I've got. We employ an autistic member of staff where I work, and he has unleashed a compassion amongst the company in many ways, because he's a brave man who's a campaigner for disability, you know, and he has a role in our finance department, and he does some creative roles as well. And I would never have gone down that journey of employing consciously employing an autistic person, because that goes back to, as I said earlier, the autism is a human rights issue in many ways, because there's such underrepresentation in employment for one. So yeah, that's all. Everything comes from Isaac, really. Every act I do, everything I do in life now, has a feel of him. If that makes sense.
Completely and
Yeah.
totally. Could you possibly share another story, perhaps? Perhaps family life. Isaac has a little sister, you say.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so what does that look like?
That's kind of amazing. So he has a sister she's about to be 8. So she's kind of 5.5, 6 years younger than him, and she is neurotypical. So she's non-autistic, and that's been an extraordinary experience, because, as I say, so as you pointed out earlier, ours was our first child, so we knew nothing to compare about what childhood would be. When Tabitha was born, you do obviously question, you know, I think statistically you're slightly more likely to have an autistic child if you have one. They're significant, but it's still very, you know, the number of autistic people is it somewhere anywhere between 1 in 70 and 1 in 100. It
Right.
changes all the time because diagnostic criteria are changing. There's a lot of misdiagnosis or underdiagnosis. When there's a sibling, there's slightly higher chance, but it's still less likely to happen than happen. But we were aware, and I think I was, you know, we were sort of prepared for what it might look like if she was. The most interesting thing that happened was she displayed all the behaviors and reached all the milestones of a typical child. So everything that I was expecting with Isaac, and was kind of told, don't worry about it, did actually happen with Tabitha. And I became a more understanding person of people who didn't have autism in their life, because I was like, oh, now I see what you mean. I could tell when she was having a tantrum. Her tears kind of frustrated me, upset me a little bit. Isaac's tore me apart because they were different. Of course, sometimes she was upset, but primarily she was making her way in a world that has an infrastructure set out for her. And my experience of her, you know, all those milestones was just, it actually made me more understanding of parents of non-autistic children, if that doesn't sound too strange, because I suddenly realized people were just trying. When I was getting so upset and frustrated and feeling a failure at
Right.
parenthood, and having a son who was so upset, I kind of got defensive, thought people didn't understand, what are they trying to do? And they didn't understand, but it was all incredibly well intentioned. And I think I'd have been exactly the same, because now I understood. I thought, oh, that's how you reassure a child. You know, if they have a tantrum, or if they get upset, or if they, if they don't want to play with a friend, or if you want to reward them. All these very typical behaviours that, in my experience, autistic people don't respond to in the same way. Tabitha did very naturally and seamlessly. And it's amazing how, you can default into that behaviour. And I did, as a parent of a second child.
I think that's just so lovely, because essentially what you're saying, Matt, is that I suppose in some ways, if I were to really kind of break down what you've just said, it's like, look at me, I'm the parent of an autistic child. This is when you have only one child. And you guys don't even understand.
Yeah.
And you don't have any sympathy. And all you can do is talk about your kids and so on and so forth. And then, of course, you have a kid who is not autistic. And then you realize, actually, whoops. That is so lovely of you to be so honest and share that. Because, I mean, of course, all parents, I'm a parent, my children are young adults now, but any parent anywhere in the world knows it's tough when the children arrive, and we have to learn to live, and nobody's giving us any training, and we just figure it out the hard way. But some people might have it harder for X reason. But it was almost your unconscious bias, I suppose, was almost like, perhaps maybe it's unfair that I'm saying this, but almost feeling a little sorry for yourself and saying, why don't you people understand? This is about what I'm going on with. You've just got kids, who are neurotypical. What's your problem, kind of thing?
Yeah.
Is that would that be fair, or am I being too?
No. I think that's totally fair. I think I did feel that, and it was. I wouldn't go so far. It was probably, you could say it was self-pity to self, but it was probably a sort of self-care mechanism of my own. I think I needed to sort of, it was a way of looking after myself, I guess. But there is an element of that, because I think it was one of the, I look back now and I sort of think, well, it's partly why I want to campaign and have a sort of activism element to what I do, because when I see parents going through that, I just want to help them and reassure them, because there's a lot of help out there. And the world needs to understand it. And I think it's such a strange all at sea feeling, that I had never had before. And as I said, I didn't have it the second time round. Now things are all changing, and all the other parental sort of struggles come in, but it's a particularly unique experience, that when you don't know something but something's wrong, and being in that, it's the only time I've had it in my life, really, when you're just utterly baffled by something, and deep down you have all these sort of instincts that something's wrong. What is it? And it's so discombobulating. Discombobulating being one of Isaac's favourite words, because he says it when he gets discombobulated by noisy sounds or some sensory overload. But it was so for me from those early years, because I just didn't know what was going on. So there was a defence mechanism.
But it's actually not necessarily only in relation to you happening to have a child who is autistic and seeing other parents. Any one of us who've had any kind of challenges in our lives, no matter what it is. I mean, it could be that as an individual, that somebody is diagnosed with a very serious illness, but they don't know the diagnosis until it is diagnosed. Okay, forget the illness. Someone is having a breakup in a marriage. True. But they don't feel that do you see where I'm going? It doesn't have to be a physical illness. It doesn't have to be autism. It could be anything that you're feeling, hang on a minute, that doesn't feel right in the pit of my stomach. And then you're trying to figure that out, you as in whoever us is. And of course, then you look at us, you look at the world around you, who are trying to advise you in the best way possible, but you're not listening to them, because you don't get what's going on in the pit of my stomach. So it really is so powerful at so many levels. If we take away the headline of the fact that, yes, you have a son who is autistic, it's a common denominator amongst all of us, I think. just
Yes,
human
no,
beings and challenges that we face.
yeah, you're right. You're totally right. And I think there probably are challenges that I wouldn't, that I've had there where there is that similarity. And you don't, yeah, it's so true. You kind of can't work out how you ever got there, or why, how it's going on, or how much loss of control you've got. But you have an instinct that tells you something's wrong. It's a really strange, overpowering human emotion. You're absolutely right. Which is why, when we got the label, and it was really rapid in that the minute I heard of the word autism in context to him, he was kind of diagnosed within about 24 hours. All the other, there was a lot when we were seeing therapists and speech therapists and stuff, because there were these delays going on. The word autism wasn't used for about 10 months. So that whole period of time was equally all at sea, because no one was really saying what's the problem. No one's really diagnosing anything. They were just coming to some quite vague assumptions. And then once that word was used and talked about and he was diagnosed, it was an enormous, it was liberating. A lot of other emotions came into play as well around coming to terms with it, and understanding about it's an unlevel playing field and all these other things, but they became more tolerable and controllable. I think you could go and do some research about them, you could educate and stuff, although, as I've touched upon, we did have that initial period of where not a lot of people seemed to want to embrace it. There was still a kind of need to normalize even at that stage.
Oh, I could talk forever, Matt, but I wonder, so do you sort of have any kind of tools in your toolbox where you sort of manage your unconscious biases? You talked about compassion and the fact that you've learned compassion, but what does it actually look like? What does it make you do in terms of challenging unconscious biases that creep up every once in a while?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. Funnily enough, and this might be going off on a tangent, so stop me, but I think all interaction with Isaac I'm unconsciously biased in that he reminds me so often that, so I often speak to him like a neurotypical human, which is often using all these things like double meanings. You're not giving, your facial expression isn't actually saying what you mean. And these things he calls out all the time on me in a really polite way. So he's like, "Dad, are you happy?" If my face is really, because I've got quite a grumpy face. And I'll be saying, "Yeah, I'm happy. This is just my resting face." And he says, "Okay, I just need to know that you're happy." Or I'll say something and it will be, the other, what was it? The other day we were driving somewhere and I was in a bit of a hurry to go somewhere. And I said, "Look, there's too much traffic. I think we just need to go straight back home." And he said, "How can we go straight back home? We're on a one-way road. That's completely impossible." And those things
delightful.
happen. Yeah, they are all the time. And I think I've constantly got a kind of unconscious bias around.
You've got your monitor at home.
Yes, I
love it.
So do have. And
you're
also,
so lucky.
Yeah, and within that, even last night we were chatting and he was talking about, what's this phrase, a pinch of salt? And he's trying to explain. We said, "Why do we use this phrase, a pinch of salt?" And I was kind of like, God, it's true. And I tried to explain what it was, and I was going to get Google up, but metaphors, and which I do use a lot when I write, and I'm not going to stop using them because he's started to understand idioms and metaphors. But the way we can just flow and speak and assume people understand things, he brings me up on a lot, and I think it's only for good. And I think that sort of feeds into compassion, where you see the whole person and you explain things and you try and understand what they're doing or why they're like that. I think it's interesting you brought up that when you see a child in the supermarket kicking its feet, why do we always assume he or she is naughty? Or why do we think the parent isn't doing a good job? Why don't we, what it's taught me is stop and go, actually, there might be something wrong with the child. Maybe there's an overstimulation, or
Exactly.
there's a routine's been broken, or something. If there's a child's a fussy eater, is it because they've got sensory issues? It's that sort of way I try and see people for. I think everyone, not see all the good in people, but just try and understand people more beyond how we're kind of programmed to just operate within the kind of pillars of society, if you like.
Oh gosh, absolutely. You've hit the nail on the head, and you're very lucky because you have someone who will remind you on a daily level, whereas we've got to work on it on ourselves.
Yeah,
But
that's
Matt,
true.
I mean, I have so enjoyed talking to you, and for
Likewise.
those of us listeners who want to read what Matt has written, his blog is called My Son Isaac. That's one word, .net. Matt Davis, thank you so very much for sharing your stories of unconscious bias.
It's a pleasure. So I've really enjoyed it. Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening. If you like this podcast, please do share with someone. That's the best promotion the podcast can have. The more we hear these amazing and brave stories from speakers around the world, the more we can learn about this important subject of unconscious bias. I'm Smita Tharoor. See you next week.